So thank you again to everyone who could join us today. My name is Elizabeth Heald, and I'm the President and CEO of the Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation, and I'm just delighted that you can be here to join us in the second in our series of anti-racism, the need to decolonize not-for-profits. Throughout the next hour, you will hear from 4 Black and Indigenous leaders in our community about important topics that are relevant and very prevalent today. These speakers include Terre Chartrand, Mohammed, Dorothy Nyambi, and Nasir Salih. In the essence of time, we are sharing their bios in the chat function, so please take a look to learn more about these incredible leaders. This is not a presentation, it's a conversation with people with lived experiences sharing their stories. We encourage you and thank you for taking the time to educate yourselves. I also just want to inform you that we will be sharing resources relevant to decolonizing not-for-profits after this webinar. If you have other resources you believe would be useful, we encourage you to share them using the chat function, and they will be added to the resource list to be distributed. One last comment before I invite our guests to join and introduce our moderator, Lori Campbell. I heard this quote on the radio and shared it at our first anti-racism conversation back in June. I wanted to share it again with you today. Treat racism like COVID-19. Assume you have it, listen to experts about it, don't spread it, and be willing to change your life to end it. So thank you for joining us today and over the next hour for your willingness to learn and be part of the change that is critically needed. I would now like to invite Lori Campbell and our guests to join us. Lori Campbell recently joined our board and probably goes without the need for introduction. I believe her bio is being shared in the chat though. Lori, I'm going to turn it over to you to lead the conversation. I have to ask Lori the first question first. I forgot about that. I am waiting with bated breath. Lori, so before we open it up to the panelists, would you please describe what you feel colonization was in the context of not-for-profits? And now you have to take yourself off mute. I can do that, I think. All right, so as I mentioned, if we're having technical difficulties, you can put it in the chat, but what happens when we're having technical difficulties?
Okay. Oh
there we go.
I knew you could see me, but I lost the screen, so I couldn't find the mute button. I'm so sorry.
No problem. No problem. So Laurie, just to reopen this up, I just wanted to ask you what you feel colonization is in the context of not-for-profits, and then I'll let you lead the rest.
Sure, I'll do a little bit of an introduction and a territorial acknowledgement, I think, first to start us off.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Tansei Nitotamak, I apologize for my tech issues here. You'd think I would have it figured out by now. Nanasko mamawi atawama mittanimi wasin kotaki sigawa wapa tamak. Nia Lori Campbell, Nia Two Spirit Nehio, Nitapitiko Sasana Nia Ochi Muniawi Sagahigini, Treaty 6 Territory Kiwitino, Saskatchewan Ochio. So hello and welcome, my friends. I thank the creator just when I started here because it's beautiful that we get to see another day. So my name is Lori Campbell. I'm a Two-Spirit Cree Métis with roots from Montreal Lake Cree First Nation in Treaty 6 territory in northern Saskatchewan. And I'm very happy to be here with you all today to moderate this very important discussion, and grateful to see that so many people have signed up. So it's really exciting. And I want to first acknowledge that we are broadcasting today from lands that are situated that are deeply connected to Indigenous peoples who have historically lived and who currently live in this territory. And these groups include the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And like the lands of my ancestors in Treaty 6 territory, I recognize that these particular lands have always been the source of learning for Indigenous peoples here. And as I am a guest on these lands, I am committed to respecting the traditional knowledge that they have derived from these lands and to learning from their experiences on them. So that first question, Elizabeth, colonization in relation to not-for-profits. So I think, I think about that in the context of it's, all the rules and regulations that came into place with colonization that now dictate who has access to support and who doesn't. And I think about it in the context of long before not-for-profits were formed, our communities took care of one another. And certainly what I see today is that these same marginalized groups, our communities still implement our practices of taking care of one another. But because we don't form the formal not-for-profit organizations and don't follow the colonial rules, we can't always have access to those resources that are set out to, supposedly help benefit us. And here's the thing that it really, in my mind, kind of boils down to is people make rules and people can change rules. People can choose a colonized process and people can also choose to decolonize processes. And so, I kind of think of it as, decolonization means really like about decentering whiteness and colonialism and colonial structures, thinking in context of co-op models and collective models and ways to dismantle oppressive systems, essentially. So, but we're here to listen to these amazing panelists that we have. I'm so excited that everybody has been able to join us. So to get us started, the first question is we're gonna start off with Terre. And the question is, when you consider decolonization with respect for not-for-profits, what is one way a not-for-profit can provide a decolonized approach to their work? Terre.
Bonjour. I don't know, can people hear me? Can someone give me a thumbs up? I can't see my video, so, oh, hold on, there we go. Okay, thank you, Laurie. Okay, bonjour, Ani, jusqu'à quoi, Nadijnakas, Ajijak Dodam, Kichisiprini, Algonquin, Nadunjaba, New Dundee, and Dayang. Good afternoon, everyone. So in English, I just introduced myself. My name is Terre Chartrand, and I'm Algonquin Nation, Crane Clan, and I live in New Dundee, which is in Waterloo region. So the first question, so there's I've struggled a lot with decolonizing my not-for-profit. So my not-for-profit is called Pins and Needles Fabric Company, and it's an inter-arts not-for-profit. But some of the things that we've done is we've declined funding when it's insufficient to pay people. And that's a really difficult thing to do because it stops our work. But we do that, and we generally send a letter indicating that the funding does not cover the costs, so the project cannot be done. And then often we'll send letters to, if it's a foundation, people who support that foundation, letting them know that the work that they're trying to fund is not able to be done with insufficient funding. So one of the big problems is applying for funding and using a lot of human resource to navigate those funding applications, which requires often a great deal of education. And not just formal education, but education specifically in the languages that are used in funding applications, which tend to be colonial languages. And I don't just mean English, but the jargon form of English that is required to navigate that space is often a difficult space for a lot of people who have not had access to education or those spaces where those things are addressed. Another thing that we've done is we've established kind of a 3-board structure, which sounds like a lot of overhead, but really we have our colonial board that governs, and it's still done in the process of a circle and with the attempt to decolonize that level of work. We have an advisory board of elders and knowledge keepers, and they inform a lot of the work that we do. And then we have the structure of the people who are doing the work, so the artists that we support, including myself. I sit with all 3 of these levels of governance, but all 3 of these levels of governance have access to each other, and it's open-ended, and and all have access to decision making at the lowest level and the highest level. So there's a lot of transparency, but also that upper level governance board does a lot of the work to try to shelter the work that we do from those colonial structures of funding agencies and those sorts of areas. So even though the artists who all work with pins and needles are all decision makers, and we worked under flattened hierarchies, we try to maintain a structure where those artists are supported without having to learn those colonial languages unless they want to, where we will support in all ways, making sure that they have full access to everything that Pins and Needles is doing. So the other thing we do is we have full transparency about our funding and about how decisions are made. So even an artist who works with us for a couple weeks has full knowledge of what the grants are and how the structure is funded and where the money flows and all of that, so that everybody understands and has the ability to put input into those spaces. In large projects, we generally don't operate with a directorship. So in interarts, it works a lot like theater, where you have top-down direction of projects, where there's an artistic director or someone like that who dictates how the work is created and what's created. Whereas what we do is we operate in a model where the collective creates the entire body of work. So the other challenge about that is, in applying for funding, you have to have a very clear picture of what your work looks like. So before you receive the funding. So really a lot of the work has to be done before the project is even really conceived in an appropriate way where people are compensated. Some of what we do is we try to make sure that we communicate. So this is with that upper level governance piece. We communicate clearly with our funders so that they are aware that the picture that we're giving them of the project, we will do our best to make it match the final output, but it's not always going to be that way, depending on what those voices are who contribute to the project. So you know, this isn't an arts model, so it's that creative space. But yeah, so for us, it's really about valuing the contribution of Indigenous artists. And making sure everyone is compensated, and that we're clear about compensation, and that people can choose what they will add to a project based on that contribution. So not the contribution, sorry, their compensation. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. Thank you, Lori. Miigwech.
Thank you, Terre. Let's move over to Umi. Same question. When you consider decolonization with respect to not-for-profits, what is one way not-for-profits can work to decolonize their approach?
I think you mentioned this a little bit when you were answering the question yourself, but for me, when I thought about this question, it really took me back to, I understand what colonization means and looks like as a marginalized person. I can feel it in my bones. It's something that has historically been part of my life for as long as I've existed, but also far beyond me. So I decided to get on Google and do a little bit of research for myself to be able to explain and understand this from a context that's not so directly connected to me emotionally. So the textbook definition for colonization is involving one group of people taking control of lands, resources, languages, cultures, and relationships of another group. And I say this for us to be able to have an understanding of what we mean when we speak about decolonization. And the textbook definition of that is essentially decolonization is for oppressed people to be free from colonial status so that essentially they are given their power back. We know that colonization has created systems that have left certain groups of people marginalized. And until we dismantle these systems, we can't really decolonize. We can't give people their power back if the same systems that chain them up are still in place. In order to decolonize, we must completely rethink the way that we do our work in the nonprofit sector and what role we play in deconstructing these systems. If we want systems to change, then nonprofits have to play a role in advocating for these changes to happen, but not just nonprofits. Funders also have to rethink about who they're investing in and how they're investing in communities to dismantle these systems. We can't exist to provide handouts and expect for change to occur, because we essentially are working alongside colonial and imperial systems, and the cycle of oppression is not going to end. So in order to decolonize nonprofits, we have to recenter power and ensure that we are investing in a future where every single individual on this planet has the resources necessary for them to live the life they see fit for themselves. We also need to rethink about charities and the ways in which we consider ourselves noble and kind people. No one really wants to stand in line to get food, for example. That's not dignifying. We must really be thinking about how to be giving people opportunities to fend for themselves. And this honestly can be a very comforting reality, especially as someone who does work in nonprofit, because that means that we in the nonprofit sector are essentially thinking about working ourselves out of jobs. And I know that's very uncomfortable. However, that's what we should have been created for in the first place. If we are still around after 100 years and we're still providing the same types of programmings and poverty is still a societal concern, then we aren't investing in our communities appropriately. As a leader of a grassroots initiative and someone who works in a nonprofit organization or nonprofit space, I pray that one day that I'm able to hold myself and my team accountable in ensuring that we are building a vision that's centered on us, not tackling the same problems for the next 100 years. We are going to be investing in our communities and giving them the resources and skills they need to build their own futures. We have to relinquish the power in order for us to be giving power back to our communities. And that's a very hard place to be in, but I think it's definitely something that's possible. And I've got a lot of faith in nonprofits and funders and us as individuals in the communities that we live in.
Thank you for those words. Nasir, over to you. How would you respond to that? Off mute.
Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me now. Yeah, look, I agree with Sister Umi. I really think there has to be a total mindset change in the way that we think and the way that we approach this issue. So just to introduce myself a little bit, I am a youth leader at AFRO, and our intention at AFRO is to create an environment of youth leaders. And so we've hired, trained, and put youth from marginalized and vulnerable communities in leadership roles, because, you know, it makes sense that these guys are the ones who will know what best to do with their own community, since they've been through it and they know what to expect. And that's why I believe that it's imperative that not-for-profits ensure that the ones who ultimately make the decisions are those who come from the communities who are directly impacted by the decisions being made. There's just too many instances that I've seen where the people in power, the ones who are able to make changes, are people who are in positions of privilege and are therefore unable to relate to or empathize with the ones they claim they want to help. And so it only makes sense to give that authority and power to people who are from the affected communities, like Black and Indigenous people of color and gender minorities as well, and listen to what they're saying about the challenges impacting their respective communities.
Awesome. Thank you, Nasir. And over to you, Dorothy. You're on. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, no, thanks, Laurie. Just want to say, not to duplicate what Umi, Nasir, or Terre have already said. It is really, I really like how Umi, situated the academic definition of what is decolonization. I think it really puts it into square perspective for us. And I push it again towards looking at it, once we have that definition clear, what does it really mean to shift power? I think there's a lot of good intention, there's a lot of talk, but how do we actually make sure that that power shift happens? So when we have a young man or a young woman in a place, an Indigenous person, a genderly marginalized person, that they actually have the authority and the power to make those decisions. So we don't have people in positions of tokenism, but that we really truly decolonize in such a way that their input is valued and it's taken very seriously. So it's the only piece I would like to add about our not-for-profit organizations and how that decolonization plays itself. Because sometimes we do put people in positions where they don't have the power, they're not given the agency, or they are not even able to take that agency that they need to bring their thinking to the table. Okay, thanks, Laurie.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, I heard some comments there about essentially what I heard was, you know, we can, as Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, we can assimilate if we want to follow, you know, and have access to some of those resources, which I think is, you know, extremely problematic. And also that, you know, that we need to think about the system. Why is it that, you know, we aren't changing the system that is making people have to access the services of not-for-profits, because we can continue to have, as Umi was saying, the not-for-profits forever, rather than solve the issue that puts people in the space to actually have to need to access not-for-profits. Question number 2, and we're going to start with Nasir on this one. There's been a proliferation of not-for-profits over the last 30 years due to a number of factors, including the end of federal funding for social housing, defunding the social net, etc. So can you reflect on how this has impacted your work or led to the creation of your not-for-profit?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think the decrease in funding directly impacts our communities, the communities of color, and those that are already the most vulnerable. And I'm sure the same could be said about the other minority communities as well. People who are already struggling, working precarious jobs and long hours, who are barely scraping by, are so overwhelmed with providing the necessities that it becomes impracticable to access opportunities for their communities, their children, or even themselves. So that's what makes these grassroots groups, and organizations so important. Like, for instance, the African Family Revival Organization, or AFRO for short, which is the organization that I'm proud to be a part of, provides a safe space for the youth of our community between about 16 and 24 to come together, play sports, learn about their history, on top of just so many other great things. So these are the same youth that aren't able to afford gym memberships or community sports teams, that require resources that unfortunately they just don't have access to. So that's why groups like ours and Project Up, for instance, and these other grassroots groups and organizations are so vital to our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasir. Let's go over to Terre again.
Hi, Laurie. I really did a lot of thinking about this question because I've been really thinking a lot about decolonizing space and work and all those sorts of things this summer. And one of the things that kept coming up to me are two things. One is the basis of working and having to ask for money as colonized people who have had all of our resources stolen and things built on those resources that make the people who have stolen those resources wealthy. And then kind of the irony of having to be in a space where it often feels like begging for those resources back. One of the things I've been thinking about is how do we approach reparations, and that the entirety of Black and Indigenous work is done from a space of theft to begin with, and that the model of having to do a lot of the work ahead of time without pay in asking for funding, and then being very unsure whether or not that funding will come through and having it always be insufficient is something that needs to be addressed from kind of the examination and even opposition from grassroots organizations. So for me, I've been thinking a lot about what reparations look like, and how funding models need to start looking at, sorry, I'm gonna sneeze. Oh, excuse me. Instead of seeing the work that's being done by Black and Indigenous organizations as charity or not-for-profit work, but instead the necessary work that is owed to Black and Indigenous people, the money that is owed to Black and Indigenous people for the original impact and the ongoing impact of colonization, and the violence of the structures that have denied land and labor and life to Black and Indigenous people.
Absolutely, thanks, Terre. I'm just going to repeat question 2. Somebody's missed the question. So the question number 2 was, there's been a proliferation of not-for-profits over the last 30 years due to a number of factors, including the end of federal funding for social housing, defunding the social net, etc. So I'm asking the panelists if they could reflect on how this has impacted their work or led to the creation of their not-for-profit. And I'm going to go over to Dorothy next.
Yeah, no, thanks, Laurie. I think I come at this with a little bit of a slightly adjacent hat, because I work for an international not-for-profit organization. So some of what is in the context here in Canada may not apply, but the framework within which you get a proliferation of NGOs applies across the world, doesn't matter where you are. And I think there's several factors that we need to think about. And the first one is, and sometimes this proliferation is because there's need for access, as Nasir has said, but sometimes this is also promoted by donors. And I really consider that another sort of trying to have an invisible act of colonization, because donors make sure that there are 3,000 NGOs, they're competing for the same funding, they're having preferred NGOs and not preferred NGOs. So because the donors have the funds, there's this proliferation of NGOs, there's duplication of efforts and competition instead of collaboration. And again, that is sometimes encouraged by the nature of the funding. I think the honors of how NGOs should try to collaborate and not compete, whether it's internationally or in Canada or in the KW region, is really important. Already as NGOs, there are many NGOs working on African issues and Black issues and Afro-Caribbean issues. How do we, on our side, begin to come together so that we can coordinate, we can be really, harmonize, so that the resources that are available, we can use them in the best ways possible. So I think for me, the issue of a proliferation of not-for-profits, the funders have to do their part to stop this competition and continue to just give money to whoever is the flavor of the season. And then we as NGOs working on these issues, how do we come together and begin to look at collaboration, increase effectiveness, and rather than competition? So I'll leave it there for now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Last statement you made, you were talking a little bit about good intentions, and I think about how a lot of good intentions have caused a lot of harm. And what you were speaking about just there made me think about, it's not just the organizations competing, but in the Indigenous community, like I know we've talked amongst ourselves, because it puts us in a position of competing against each other for access to resources, which goes against our ways of engaging with each other, and it makes it really challenging and really causes harm within our communities, and I really think that's something that is important to think about. Over to you, Umi, for this question now. Thank you.
Thank you. I think something that my co-panelists have touched upon is how connected we are to these communities that are really impacted when federal cuts occur. We are, and the people that we serve and the individuals that we are come from backgrounds where when funding happens, we are the hardest hit. We are these people, we are the groups who get the crappy end of the stick when it comes to defunding social networks. That's why our work, I believe, is so important, because it's our reality. We are the ones relying on social assistance. We're the ones who have to work paycheck to paycheck just to meet our basic human rights. We aren't really solving other people's problems. We're solving our own problems. We aren't separated from these issues. We are affected by them at every intersection of our existence. And this honestly has informed more than anything that the work that we have to do, and the reason why Project Up, the Storied Mind podcast, and other grassroots organizations like ours exist. It's because the lack of investment from the federal government and other organizations have really left us in precarious situations as individuals with intersecting needs that are all competing. And it's created an unstable environment where we have to fight and fend for opportunities. And coming from this sort of environment where resources were already scarce, we didn't really know how to create a foundation for individuals so that they are able to actually succeed. And succeed in a space where they are surrounded by people who look like them, where they are represented throughout their entire beings. So all of their intersectionalities are represented. We were not represented anywhere we looked in Waterloo region. That's why we created Project Up. I didn't see a Black Muslim girl leading me in a program. Nobody understood my barriers. Nobody understood my being and everything that comes with my being and my history. So we had to create space for ourselves and by ourselves because we didn't have any other choice. We were not prioritized, so we had to prioritize our survival. Project Up was honestly initiated by our community, and we'll continue to do work that centers the voices of our community. We have to do this work whether the federal government is supporting us or it will not happen. We have to do this work whether other nonprofits and funders are supporting us because it's not going to happen if we don't do it. And honestly, this is the only way our communities will thrive because the social landscaping that was created for our communities were never ideal because they were not part of creating them, because we were not part of creating them in the first place. We did not have the investment coming into us. So instead of waiting, we had to forge the way for ourselves. We have had to fundraise amongst ourselves in order for us to be sustainable. Can you imagine? Marginalized communities who have barely any resources are coming together, pulling whatever resources they have for them to be able to thrive together. And it's something that my community is continuing to do from the beginning of colonization and all of the things that have been occurring to us. So yeah, this is, our being has just informed us and constantly reminded us that there's no other space for us. So we have to continue to create space for ourselves. It's a very unfortunate reality, but it's our reality. So essentially why Project Up, and I believe a lot of other grassroots organizations like ours and a lot of nonprofits that do some of the work that we do have started and began, because I know that's why we have.
And if I may just jump in, Laurie, without putting up my hand, to just say what Umi has just said, it goes back to question number one. And, the question number two is really related because these not-for-profits are being created because people don't see themselves represented in the leadership, in the staff, in the boards, in terms of who they're trying to help. And it is that approach, that sort of, I know better, I can decide what is good for you without knowing your reality. Or it is that attitude of not actually respecting what we call lived experience. What that lived experience that Umi and her group or Nasir and the group are bringing to the table. So I just wanted to make the link between that question two and back to the first question, we tried to talk about. Thanks, Laurie.
Absolutely, thank you, Dorothy. I mean, you're just mic dropping me, but thinking about like we're living the experiences while at the same time trying to access these funds. And I know, there were lots of resources available, certainly, shortly into COVID that we could be applying for and accessing, but most of us were so busy on the front lines, taking care of our communities that we didn't have time. And back to what Terre said earlier about the process up front, to spend the time to write a proposal, to take time to access those resources is different. And we're still always seem to be on the end of having to apply and having to ask to have our needs met, basic needs, when we're hit the hardest in these challenging times. I also want to bring it back to something Nasir said earlier on too, because you talked a little bit about, and I'm an athlete, and I think, I've often wondered about like these spaces that then get taken over, and Terre spoke about it too, but for example, fitness, being able to have access to a gym that's not just an outside gym, but an indoor gym that has all the things that we need so that we can keep ourselves active and healthy, informed community. But what happens is it gets taken over and we get charged these enormous amounts and we can't even have access to those spaces, and the challenges of that. And so I just wanted to recognize that as well. Okay, question 3, and we're going to start with Dorothy on this one. Our community has been discussing the importance for all not-for-profits to gather data on a disaggregated basis. What data should be gathered, both about your operation, but also the people you serve? Who should have access to it? And why is it important or not?
Yeah, thanks again, Laurie. I'm really passionate about this. And the first reason is, in Canada, we do have data. Each time this question has come up over the past 6 months, especially when it comes to racialized issues, we do have data. There's been myriads of studies, and I won't go into those. I have a full list of tens and tens of studies already done in Canada that tells us how the marginalization has happened for Indigenous people, for Black people, for people of other colors and other gender tendencies. So we do have the data. But I really just want to draw everybody's attention before I come back to not-for-profits, that many of us would have seen the study that came out in December 2019, before COVID became a pandemic, before the George Floyd event, on the race relationships in Canada. And I want everybody to go back and look at that study. And it is so important, and that we don't spend time trying to say we need to go collect data. We have data. I don't think there's any of these organizations that doesn't know the data for the communities that they work with. And so let us not focus so much on the data because it already exists. Let us not use it as a delay tactic, to stop funding and doing the work and funding the work at the right level. So, because I will look to those who are already working at the grassroots level in Canada, to Umi and Nasir, Terre, to talk to us about the data that you already have. But my point here to open up this conversation was to say, we have data, there's data in lots of places. Let us not use that lack of data as a piece to say, we're not able to do this work because we don't have the data. We have the data, there's lived experiences. I'm hearing, just listening to Umi and Nasir and Terre, the data, I'm hearing data right there. So let's move forward to work with what we have and continue to collect, data. So I'll stop there, Laurie, but would certainly want to hear from our colleagues who work in the grassroots, what other additional data they think will be needed to help their work get funded.
Thank you, Dorothy. Over to you, Nasir.
Yeah, I 1000% agree with the sentiments that Dorothy was saying, and I do think that we do have the data, a lot of the data, important data available. And I think what we need to do as grassroots organizations, and as well as what the not-for-profits need to do, is appropriately use that data. And I think it's because this information is accessible to the public, it should be used by decision makers in the municipal, the provincial, and the national levels to make the appropriate decisions, and not just make the appropriate decisions, but put the appropriate people in the positions to make those decisions. And I think because it's important to not decide on solutions for groups of people, but to allow them to make decisions for themselves, because I think they're the best fit to do that, and make sure it's grounded on data. And I think that's the best solution moving forward.
Thank you, Nasir. It really made me think of often, some data's collected and taken forward, and then somebody outside of the community makes a decision about the interpretation, and then spits out back at us what it is that they think we need. And it's it's not made by the people who are within that data, and so it often comes back as something that is definitely not going to work for us, and often causes further harm to us. Did you have some more to say on that, Lisa?
For sure, yeah. I agree 100%. I just think that the type of data that should always be collected is data that includes things that help us better identify the different groups, especially the ones that are the most vulnerable, including gender-based data, data related to race, socioeconomic status, and this data should be actively used to improve programs and services. And I think, for example, me being a Black Muslim male in this community, I know on a first account basis how our communities are being affected. So putting educated people who come from these communities in position to appropriately use this data, I think, is the best strategy moving forward.
Thank you, thank you. Umi, same question. Oh, and then back to Dorothy for a comment.
And I was just going to make a comment on what Nasir has said about, that again is about making sure that, that power is given, that power and that respect of that lived experience that Nasir brings is taken into account, that the data that is collected is actually for use and not just for 2 or 3 people to get their PhDs. And we have a lot of that, being done. And let it be people from these communities doing their PhDs, getting those PhDs, but bringing in at a level where those studies are going to actually help the work that is being done, So over to you, Tumi.
Yeah, I think to add on to what Nasir was saying, when we talk about disaggregated data, we're really talking about data that shows us a clear picture about who it is that we are serving. This data, at a very bare minimum, should honestly be including demographic pieces, including gender. And we need to start expanding our understanding of what we've known gender to be and being very intentional about that. But it also does include race-based data. This data has to be analyzed individually for us to be able to see how it impacts the groups of people that we are serving. We have to be very inclusive about the data that we are collecting, and we also have to be very inclusive about the way that we are collecting this data. There should be information sharing between organizations that are serving the population within Waterloo region, so that we are able to clearly see who it is that is not being served appropriately, and we're able to invest in serving people the way that people want to be served, or at least to have an understanding of the specific challenges that people are facing. If we don't have this data, then we don't know what's going on, which is going to create a room for assumptions, which is historically what's been happening. And honestly, that's a very colonial way of working. We have to effectively be able to clearly identify how our work, how our programs and services are impacting our communities. And this means that we have to be intentional about the way in which we are collecting, analyzing, sharing, and receiving this data. Also, recently, I've noticed that there's been a push for organizations to engage with different groups and individuals. This can't really be done effectively if we don't have the right data to tell us who to engage with and how to engage with them and why we should be engaging with them in the first place. We have to go beyond collecting data for the sake of collecting data. There has to be action behind it. It's nice to be able to say, we know X number of people are in this community. Fantastic. But what are you doing with that? How is it advising the programs and the services that you're providing? But also, how is it advising the structure of your organization and the vision and mission and values of your organization? We need to start really thinking about when we're creating things to include every single person that needs to be included, rather than thinking about other people as an afterthought. It's difficult for us to shift and change things when we've put structures in place that have existed for such a long time and are very stagnant. You need to start creating with people, for people, and you need to have them at the forefront. To do that, you need to be able to know who's there and what do they need and why are they there and why is it important for you to be engaging with them and reaching out to them and participating in the same shared space. So yeah.
Thank you. I often find that, like those of us that are here, like we're the most studied, our groups are the most studied groups out there, right? Marginalized groups. And there's so much information out there already. And oftentimes I find that funding, there's a whole bunch of front end funding that will fund the research for somebody's academic purposes or for an organization to, increase their status in some way that they've, done something. But the funding on the tail end to actually take the action is the piece that is fundamentally missing as far as like having a significant amount of funding in order to do that work. And Terre, when she first started off, was speaking about, the amount of funding and whether or not it's adequate to pay for the work that needs to be done. Over to you, Terre, on that question about data.
Sorry, just before you answer, Terre, I'm gonna jump in with a commentary. I think something that you really touched upon, Lori, that stood out to me was making the point that we are very much the most studied communities, and we're not studied from a perspective of us studying ourselves and studying each other for us to get a better understanding of what we need. It's often always because people are curious about us, which is nice, and you can ask us questions about our existence if you would like to know, but really we should be at the forefront of collecting our own data, and we should be advising you because we are the ones who have the lived experiences. You cannot speak on something or understand something or are able to objectively or subjectively give your input about something without having the lived experience. I cannot speak for anyone that's not me, that's not a Black Muslim woman. So I think it's very important that we take into consideration when we're thinking about collecting data, that we are effectively representing the people that we are trying to get a better understanding of their needs, and that we're doing things from assessment perspective rather than trying to jot down the coolness or the, dare I say, what's that word, exoticness of things or people or spaces that are different to our own. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Terre.
Hi, Laurie. Data. So I spent 70 days of my life this summer at Osigonhu Hadachi Land Back Camp in downtown Kitchener, Victoria Park. And we've talked a lot about how studied we are as a population. And Indigenous people in the land called Canada are one of the most studied people in the world. Very little of that data has come back into any kind of action. And when it has, it's been ignored. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 5 years ago is just not like the most basic parts of it are only now being implemented in the region, and probably very much by my own estimation as a result of the land back camp. So I see data as useful to a point. The Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report came out, and it caused a heck of a ruckus, but it's just fallen again into that space where that data sits there. And both of those reports are really focused on telling the stories. So for me, it's taking data, making sure that stories are told through that data. Numbers on a page don't mean a lot. I find a lot of difficulty in translating that into the actual way that those numbers are addressed. So it's assumed that it's between 20,000 and 30,000 Indigenous people who live in Waterloo region, and there are only 2 organizations in the municipality that serve that entire population, and that population reflects several nations. So we're not just talking about one Indigenous mass, we're talking about First Nations, Métis and Inuit, and First Nations from all over Turtle Island. The stories behind that data are also not reflected necessarily in the services provided because of the lack of funding. And these organizations are very well aware of this. Our data collection is exceptional, and I don't think we need more. What we need is for funding organizations and government organizations to hand over the reins, open the purse strings, and let the communities make decisions themselves about where this leads to, where the money goes. That the government organizations are not the ones hiring those commissions and committees anymore, that it's the communities that are doing it. And yeah, that might be someone from outside the community, it might be someone from within the community, but I'm so tired of that top-down decision structure based on numbers that people don't understand. And they can claim to understand it, but until someone in your family has gone missing, until you've experienced the kind of violence that has been caused and that continues to be perpetuated, those numbers translate to nothing. And that's exactly what we see and we continue to see. So this question is a bit of a bee in my bonnet. Funny, I got a wasp buzzing me just there. But anyway, I very much appreciated what Dorothy had to say to begin with, and everyone else has contributed excellent things. For me, we have the data, let's move on.
Absolutely, Terre. You know, you brought up two very important pieces of documents, right? The TRC with the calls to action, and the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women inquiries with the calls for justice. And what I get really frustrated with is, you know, money that gets spent instead of actually hiring people from our community to do the work in the municipality, for example. Money is taken away from us and is spent on gathering information, data about us, about what the problem is, so that the essentially white administration and white elected leaders can learn more about us. But the data is already there. We can take those calls to action and the calls for justice and implement them, rather than, you know, spending another couple $100,000 to hire a consultant to do some more research on us and about us. Okay, we're moving on to question number 4. Much of the work that happens in community happens at a grassroots level and with organizations that aren't registered charities. Fiscal sponsors support organizations that are registered charities to receive funding so that donations qualify from a tax perspective. Community Foundations of Canada is working with other organizations to have the government update these regulations, because this often perpetuates a colonized system. While this is going on, grassroots organizations continue to do critical work across Waterloo Region. What can fiscal sponsors do to assist grassroots organizations in order to serve everyone in the community and not only a select few? And we will start with Umi on this one.
I think this was mentioned a little while ago, but essentially grassroots groups are often working under limited conditions that make it very difficult for them to be able to become registered. And for some of them, they don't even have the intentions of becoming registered, because the work, because becoming registered takes away from the work that needs to be done in the community. And honestly, becoming registered, a registered organization is not really accessible to everyone. So there's already a barrier there. What's really important is that grassroots organizations don't have to jump through hoops to be able to receive the funding that we know is actually impacting the community. If grassroots organizations are doing impactful work and they have a good reputation in the community, then they don't need a sponsor to be able to get this funding. This framework really needs to be shifted completely. Grassroots groups should not have to prove extraordinary things in order for them to get funding. Conversations need to be had with grassroots organizations about what sponsors need to do to uphold their legal responsibility, but also can these fiscal sponsors advocate to provincial federal organizations to create different regulations for grassroots organizations that have proven and shown over time that they are doing impactful work in their communities. Something that fiscal sponsors can do now, in my personal opinion, is to consult grassroots groups they want to work with and create an environment where they know which groups are doing work, create a registry of who is actually doing the work, and then investing in these groups and letting them deliver on their funding without asking them for too much. It's not a one shoe size fits all. Fiscal sponsors have to meet grassroots organizations where they are at, because grassroots organizations have their heads down, too busy doing the work. Please come to us and ask us what we need. Stop always relying and expecting for us to come to you, because we're too focused on ensuring that our communities are healthy and happy, and we don't always have the capacity or the human resource or any other resource for that matter for us to be able to come and ask for funding. So come to us, meet us. We're happy to have conversations about what we are doing and how we are doing it.
Excellent. It's kind of like this twisted thing of like, we have to convince them of, you know, that, or help convince them and help educate them about what it is that we need in order for them to give us a little bit of money to do what it is we need to do. And then they want continued oversight, which also drives how it is that we're going to implement, you know, the money and resources to do what it is that our communities need to do. Dorothy, how about you on that question?
Yes, now just quickly jump in, sort of in the interest of time, to say, I think the donors, federal foundations, they need to begin to look at grassroots organizations and any other organization they fund hold people to be accountable for the results rather than the processes. We focus a lot on process and systems, and those are very important. We don't want for those to be dropped. But if you were to hold people accountable for the real results that they achieve, the change that really happens at the other end of the tunnel, I think that's where grassroots organizations who are deep in the weeds have the opportunity. If that becomes one of the big criteria that is used, hopefully they will get the funding, and that becomes something that is respected in terms of funding criteria. Because a lot of other organizations that do have the systems, have the processes, they're almost like middlemen in a business transaction, and they're not really doing the work. So we pay a lot for that middleman or that middle person, and yet the people who do the work and who can do the work don't get to have the money. So it is really the funders to reverse their thinking or to re-engineer their thinking to try to include as much as possible that impact and results is just as important as process. That's my addition to that.
Okay, we're really tight on time, and I'm going to jump ahead to the last question too, because I think it's really important. We'll start with Nasir and Terre on it. But going beyond solidarity with BIPOC and racialized communities, what are actions that not-for-profits can take moving forward? And we'll start with you, Nasir, on that one.
Yeah, well, this is kind of like in combination with the previous question as well. And I know I've said this again, and I'm really trying to hammer this point home. I just feel like saying that you're with us and that you're willing to help and things like that is great. But I think there really has to be action behind those words. And there's organizations like AFRO and other grassroots groups they're doing a lot of great things for their respective communities. But unfortunately, we're seen as like lowest priority almost when it comes to funding. And, you know, this, like Umi said before, it forces us to like jump over hurdles and through hoops and makes it difficult for these groups to stay afloat and remain sustainable and continue to improve the communities that they're trying to help. And so, but on top of that, like I already said, I think it's very, very important to recognize that not only should the fiscal sponsors and these not-for-profits provide the funding needed for these groups to flourish, but these groups also should be, I guess, autonomous, for lack of a better term, and given the freedom to make the major decisions on how the money should ultimately be used. So, like, you know, this includes giving them the independence to execute their plans without interference, without, you know, giving them a hard time and giving them a lot of pushback, while providing the resources and support to allow them to overcome any obstacles that they'll inevitably have to face throughout the process. And I think that's important beyond solidarity.
Absolutely, thank you, Nasir.
Just wanted to quickly add to say, absolutely, Nasir, it is about, again, holding these organizations accountable for results, but let us really push to make sure that the grassroots organizations can get core funding which is not very prescriptive, so that you can go out there and do what you need to do and be held accountable for the results.
Yes, exactly. It's just giving us the, like Dorothy said earlier, it's just giving us the respect. And look, I might not know like 100% the in and outs of how business works and things of that nature, but growing up in these communities, I personally feel that I'm more suited to accurately describe the problems that are going on in our communities and the steps that we can take moving forward. You know, all we need is the funding, but after that, the decisions, I feel like we're the best suited to do that.
Absolutely, nailing it, Nasir. Terre, do you have some comments on that?
For me, it's moving beyond. So solidarity has kind of become a secondary word for allyship, and allyship is a relationship based on very distinct choices and can be a shifting thing. Whereas what I would like to see is people moving into being accomplices. And when you're someone's accomplice, you are absolutely behind their success in their endeavor. And it also means that you're not acting as the agent of that success, but you're acting as an active and engaged supporter of that success, and not necessarily having input into what that requires. Like Nasir said, we are the experts in our own communities. Even someone who doesn't have a university education, who doesn't have the access to those structures, and Indigenous communities have not. We're finally seeing our very first truly deeply educated generations coming up now, and a lot of them are also elders who've gone back, but that education was not required to understand the experience of growing up as an Indigenous person in water, or in Turtle Island, anywhere, but truly to have those that purview as accomplices in our success and not allies. So solidarity being trotted out not as a word, a homonym, I guess, for allyship, but instead, how can funders and governing bodies look to grassroots and become our accomplices in building up our communities, upholding treaty rights, and start viewing funding not as a handout, but instead as the necessary money required to build us up. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Many of us have become dually educated, what I call dually educated, or dual scholars, right? We've had to learn who we are and our traditions and our culture, and then also the mainstream system of governance and academics. Umi, final words from you.
Well, much like what all of my co-panelists have said, being an accomplice, if you don't mind me stealing your word, Terre, is really relinquishing power and taking a step back, listening to what these communities have to say and letting their input advise the work that you are doing as nonprofits, and also the work that you are investing in as a funder. Action has to be taken, and we can't keep asking these communities what we can do to help and not really doing anything about it. And taking it a step further, what are we doing inside our organizations to stand in solidarity with individuals from Bipac and racialized communities inside of our workplaces? What are we doing to ensure that these individuals are represented in every single aspect of our organization? How are we holistically welcoming Bipac and racialized individuals into our organizations? How are we ensuring that these individuals feel safe and included in our workspaces? We have to be celebrating diversity every single day, not just on Black History Month or Pride Month or International Women's Day. We are serving people and not the bottom line. We have to be BIPOC, we have to have BIPOC and racialized individuals at every level of our organizations, and not just in the front lines. Being an active ally is a really hard job to take on, and it's lifelong work. We should not just be reacting to what has occurred, but we have to be proactively trying to make change. And I know we're crunched for time, but I would like for all of us to take a moment, and I would like to call all of us to action. We have to leave box checking in 2020 and prioritize making actionable decisions from here on. I urge that all you as individuals, leaders, funders, nonprofits, and private sector employees and employers, simply as human beings as well, to please find the value for yourselves in investing in people that look like me and communities like mine. We can't continue on another 500 years of oppression and lip service. I urge you and ask you to sit with the discomfort of recognizing that you have a certain level of privilege, and having that privilege challenged is really scary and uncomfortable. But also realizing that in order for growth to happen, we must challenge ourselves and sit in this discomfort. I also ask that you take stride towards making peace with the ugly history of your ancestors' past, and stop making me and my communities make peace with what has occurred to us. It's simple. We have been and still are, and I pray we never continue to do this again, to tell you that we are hurting. It needs to come to an end because we don't plan on going anywhere. But investing in our communities because we have been thriving and will continue to thrive. So join us so that we can thrive as a human race.
Thank you, Umi. That's Yeah, you just wrapped it all up. I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth now.
Oh, thank you. No. Oh my gosh, wow. Thank you so much to the panelists, to Lori. You've got me emotional now, Umi. But thank you so much for this really important conversation and discussion. Thank you, Lori, for being our moderator. You have our commitment at KWCF to do what we can to shift the power and certainly to prioritize action. So